Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Torrin. All right, I'm going to read today from Hebrews, which is towards the end of the New Testament. And I'm going to start with chapter 8 and see what we can find here. Hebrews, as the name suggests, is directed at Jewish Christians. You know, in the beginning, the church was exclusively Jewish. And so the writer to the Hebrews, who does not identify himself, but there are internal clues that make you think Paul, because he talks about being in bonds in prison, and that's kind of, Paul mentions that, though he doesn't identify himself. There's lots of theories about why some scholars theorize that the beginning of the book was lost, where he identified himself, but we don't know for sure. The early church fathers believed it was the Apostle Paul. Whoever it is, very knowledgeable, and so there's a lot of things that are talked about in this letter to the Hebrews that are especially of a character that would be familiar to Jewish readers, but not so much for us who are not familiar with the Old Testament characters and the Old Testament temple and all of the details about that. So in verse 1 of chapter 8, he's summing things up. And this is another reason I think this might be the Apostle Paul, because verse 1 says, "Now of the things we have spoken, this is the sum." In other words, this is the summary, but he goes on then, keeps talking for another 3 or 4 chapters, which Paul does that a lot. Preachers are bad about that, saying, in conclusion, and then 30 minutes later still talking. But it's intended, chapter 8 is intended to be a summation of what he's talked about up until this point, because he says, "Now of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum." Or in other words, this is the point. This is the tying it all together. And then he says, "We have such a high priest." Now we don't really understand what that means unless we read the previous chapter, so we're not going to go and read the previous chapter. I'll just try to sum it up for you. He's referring in the previous chapter to this mysterious Old Testament character named Melchizedek, who is identified as a priest, yet where he appears is in relationship to Abraham. In the timeline of the Old Testament, this is before Moses and before the law was given, and so there was no formal priesthood. So it's a little bit mysterious who this man Melchizedek is, who appears before there's the law and before there's a priesthood. And so the author in chapter 7 used Melchizedek as an example of a priest, and Abraham honored him. Abraham treated him with great reverence, this Melchizedek, even though there was no law and there was no priesthood. And the author makes an analogy, the author of Hebrews, to this Melchizedek, saying Christ, you could think of him like that, because Christ is outside of or beyond the scope of the Old Testament law. And that's the point he wants to make. So that's what he means by "we have such a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens." Verse 2 says, "A minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man." Now he's making a reference to the tabernacle of Moses, which was a man-made structure, and then later the temple, which was a man-made structure. But he's saying that Jesus is the minister of the true sanctuary, which the real thing, of which those are only symbols or types or analogies. That's the point he's trying to make. The true tabernacle. Jesus is the true high priest over the true sanctuary, of which the tabernacle and the temple that his Jewish readers would have been quite familiar with. He's saying those are merely symbols. Verse 3, "For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices. Wherefore it is of necessity that this man," meaning Christ, "have somewhat to offer." Verse 4, "For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest." He's saying if he were not who he is, if he were not in heaven, he said if he were on earth, he wouldn't be a priest, because there are priests already ordained by the law. Elsewhere in this book, he makes the point that Jesus is not even of the tribe, the group that is designated to be priests in the temple, which are the Levites. So he's saying he's outside of that system, above it. Verse 5, talking about those priests that serve according to the law. Verse 5 says, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things. Meaning the physical temple with which these early readers would have been quite familiar, he says it's a shadow or an example of a spiritual reality. And that's the best way to think about it. It's not like when we all get to heaven there's a big temple there, like the Jewish temple. He's saying that all the things in the Jewish temple were symbolic and symbolize a spiritual truth. Just like when we receive the communion, the bread and the wine are symbols of a spiritual truth. So he says, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern showed thee in the mount. Now, of course, we know that Moses went up on top of the mountain and got the 10 Commandments. If you've ever seen that movie with Charlton Heston, you know that. And he came down and his hair was all gray. So, quit staring at me. Anyway, we know that part of it. You know, that's familiar to everybody. But what's not as widely understood, unless you read it, if you read it, it's right there. When he was up there on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments, God carving them in the stone, quite a dramatic scene, I'm sure. God also gave him a pattern. He said, now when you go back down, I want you to make a tabernacle. It's like an elaborate tent. And here's the pattern. He gave him very specific directions on how to make it. And it all had symbolic meaning. There was an outer court and there was a holy place, and they had all these things in those different sections. Then in the very center of the whole thing was the Holy of Holies. And there they put the Ark of the Covenant, which had the manna in it. It had Aaron's rod that budded. And on that golden mercy seat, which was the lid on the Ark of the Covenant, once a year the high priest would sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice. And of course all that was symbolic of Christ and his sacrificial death on the cross. So God told Moses very specific directions on how to make the thing. And what this writer is saying here is that incident, or that thing that Moses did according to God's instructions, was a shadow, an example of a heavenly truth or a spiritual truth. But let's go on reading. Verse 6. But now hath he, meaning Jesus, obtained a more excellent ministry, something that is superior to that of the Old Testament priest in the physical temple. By how much more he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. Now he says here that Jesus is superior because he is the mediator. He calls him a mediator of a better covenant, better than that one which Moses was the mediator of, and established on better promises. Now, generally, we read over this word mediator, and we understand what a mediator is. Like in a contract dispute, you know, there's a person that's in the middle that kind of listens to both sides. And that is one definition of it. And I stopped and looked this word up. In the Greek language, it's a Greek word, M-E-S-I-T-E-S, pronounced mesites. Mesites. And it is a noun, and one definition is it means a go-between, which is the traditional way we think of a mediator. One who intervenes between two, I'm quoting now from Strong's Concordance, one who intervenes between two in order to make or restore peace and friendship, or to form a compact or ratify a covenant. Now that's easy to understand. We can picture Jesus as the go-between. There's God up here and us down here, and Jesus is both God and man, so he can take a hold of God and take a hold of man and bring us together, and that's one way to understand it. But there's a second meaning of this word mediator, and it's derived from the actual root word. Now I told you, and I don't mean to get into the weeds on the grammar here, but I told you that's a noun. A mediator is a noun, but the root word is a adjective, mesos, and listen to what it means. This Greek word mesos, which is the root word of where we get mediator, it actually means, the root word means in the midst of, or among, which is an interesting concept, and I want you to hold on to that. In the midst of, in the middle of, or in the midst of, or among. That's what the root word, the adjective is from which this word mediator is described. So some translations actually draw on this idea of mediator meaning a person who, or an individual who brings something out, who brings something to view, rather than just a person who's like an umpire, a person who brings something to us. For instance, in the Message translation, I think we have that. So Torrin, put that up. Let's read the Message translation on this. Is this verse 6? Yeah. But Jesus' priestly work far surpasses what these other priests do. See, now King James said he is a mediator. This says, since he is working from a better plan. Now think about that. He's working from a better plan. In other words, he's bringing something that is based on a better plan. I think that's a good understanding. Let me give you another one, and then we'll think about this. This is from the Names of God Bible. And by the way, I told you last week that when I quote from all these different translations, it occurred to me that I don't really know what they are. So I took the time to look these up. So every time I quote from a different translation, at least for today, if I don't forget next time, I looked it up to tell you what it is. So this quotes, the one I'm about to give you comes from the Names of God Bible. And if that's unfamiliar to you, that is a very modern adaptation. It's a 2011 adaptation of a 1995 contemporary English version called the God's Word translation. The Names of God Bible restores the traditional Hebrew names of God rather than using euphemisms like Lord spelled in all caps instead of Yahweh. In the Old Testament, in the King James translation, you'll see the word Lord in all capital letters, and that is actually a representation of the Hebrew word Yahweh, which is a name of God. Another example would be in the beginning in the Garden of Eden, when it talks about God said, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. Have you ever read that? God said, let us make man in our image. God, in that verse, is actually a Hebrew word, Elohim, and anytime you add I-M, him, on the end of a word, it makes it plural. That's why it says, let us make God in our image. Elohim is a plural name of God, which raises all kinds of other questions and interesting speculation. But this Names of God Bible brings out those Hebrew names. Now, we're not going to make use of that. I just want you to hear the way they translated this verse. Jesus has been given a priestly work that is superior to the Levitical priest work. Listen to this. He brings a better promise from God that is based on better guarantees. I like that. Here's another translation, the New Century Version. I'll read it to you, then I'll tell you what it is. The New Century Version says, a new agreement, the new agreement that Jesus brought from God to His people is much greater than the old one. And the new agreement is based on promises of better things. I like that. In other words, instead of just saying Jesus is a mediator, it says this is a new agreement that Jesus brought from God. I think that's a good way to understand it. Speaking of the new covenant, it's something that God intended or God ordained, and Jesus brought it into reality. Now that's the New Century Version. Here's what that is. The New Century Version was published in 1987 by the World Bible Translation Center, a nonprofit organization in Fort Worth, Texas, dedicated to translating and distributing the Bible in various languages. What I think is interesting about these different translations is they're all dealing with the same basic Greek text. And when I stop and tell you what Greek words mean, there's sometimes a little bit of flexibility in how you understand it. So these two translations, plus the Message as well, instead of just saying Jesus is a mediator, they're saying He brought something from God to us. He brought about a better covenant, a better plan. There's the message that He's working from a better, let's see, what was that? What did it say here? He's working from a far better plan. So, what is it? And what's different about it? And what is this better plan? And why is it better? That's the point we want to get to today. Well, let's go on reading. I'm going back to the King James translation now. And here's what it says in verse 7. For if that first covenant, meaning that one that Moses brought down from the mountain, if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. Now, do you understand the logic? In other words, he's saying, we wouldn't be here talking about a new covenant if that old covenant had been sufficient. If it would have got the job done, if it was satisfactory, if it was the complete solution, we would have no occasion to be talking about a new covenant. So by the very fact that Jesus said, this is my blood of the new covenant, and he doesn't even quote from Jesus, I'm just quoting that. He quotes from actually the Old Covenant itself, from Jeremiah in chapter 31. Listen to what it says in the next verse. This is a quotation from an Old Testament prophet. Verse 8 says, for finding fault with them, he saith, behold. Now this is a quote from the prophet Jeremiah. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah. Verse 9 says, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. Verse 10 says, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind, and I will write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. Verse 11 says, and they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. Verse 12 says, for I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. And then to cap it off, now he's going back to, this is now the writer. That was a quote from Jeremiah. The writer then says in verse 13, he draws your attention, or he makes this point out of that. In that he saith a new covenant, he hath made the first old. In fact, the very fact that he says, I will make a new covenant, it makes the first one old. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. Now in case the point is unclear, the Amplified translation brings it out even more plainly. We have that one. Could you put verse 13 up in the Amplified translation? It says, when God speaks of a new covenant or agreement, he makes the first one obsolete, out of use. That's what, and I could have looked it up in the Strong's Concordance and told you what the meaning was. That's what the word that's translated old means there, obsolete, out of use. And what is obsolete, out of use, and annulled because of age is ripe for disappearance, and it will be dispensed with altogether. Now, the reason he says that is, at the time that this letter to the Hebrews, at the time that it's being written, he's writing to his first audience, let's put it that way, is Jewish Christians. And they are living in a time in which both covenants basically are standing at this point side by side. Jesus has come and done his redemptive work, and as he put it, fulfilled all the requirements and promises of that old covenant. And at the Last Supper he said, I am now making a new covenant in my blood, shed for many for the remission of sins. And through Jesus and his blood, God established a new covenant. But at this time, for a little narrow window of time, it really was about 40 years, a biblical generation, they were standing side by side. You know, from the time of Jesus' death until the destruction of the temple was 40 years. And I don't think that's any accident. That's why Jesus said, this generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled, in which he described no stone being left upon another. And so this writer is writing, warning, that's his first purpose, to warn those Jewish Christians, you need to understand that the first one is obsolete now. So you need to embrace everything to do with the new one. And he's making an argument which I think we can benefit from. Now see, that's not really an issue for us because that temple is gone and will never return. And those animal sacrifices are gone and will never return. And all of those functions are now gone. And it's by the will of God. God didn't want it standing. He didn't want it there. I mean, he's referring to it exactly here. Jesus referred to that. He said, there won't be one stone left upon another that will not be thrown down. And it's all gone. And at the time when he's writing, there was a temptation for them, these Jewish Christians, to fall back into that old system. And it would have been a very dangerous, actually a dangerous thing for them to, after having embraced the blood of Jesus as the sacrifice for sins, to, for whatever reason, go back into the temple and offer an animal, the blood of an animal for the forgiveness of sins, would have been tantamount to blasphemy or sacrilege. So that's his first intent. But what I want to focus on is when he tells the details of, I think this is something we need to be conscious of, why it's better. In other words, what it is about this new covenant that is superior, that is, what it is that's so much better about it. He said that Jesus brought to us a covenant made on better promises, better guarantees. Well, Torrin, if you don't mind, go back. I'm now back in the King James translation, and I'm going to go back to verse 10. And this is when he's still quoting from the prophet Jeremiah, but let's consider for a moment what it says here. Verse 10 says this, "For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts." Now, the Old Testament law, of course, was written on tables of stone. Everybody knows that. In other words, it was external. Moses brought it down from the mountain, and it was all about, you know how it goes. You've read the Ten Commandments. They all are phrased in a kind of a formula. Thou shalt not. Is that right? Is that kind of how they go? Thou shalt not. Thou shalt not. Thou shalt not. They're all negative. They're all saying, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. But he's saying here, instead of an external law, and I'm adding this, thou shalt not, there is now an internal something that is, well, what did he say here? I will write my laws in their mind and in their hearts. Now, hold that thought for just a moment, and I want you to get this comparison. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, and I try to refrain from saying hold your finger here, and because I remember one day, it was Rod Goodman. He was sitting right back there where Elliot's sitting, and I was saying, now hold your finger in this passage and read this over here, and after a while he spoke up and said, I haven't got any more fingers, because I kept saying hold your finger. So Torrin, this is the good thing about having the computer. Torrin can just put it. Torrin, this is Romans chapter 13 and verse 8. Now this is the Apostle Paul writing in Romans. Now I just got through drawing your attention to the fact that the Old Testament law was external, written on tables of stone, and it was negative. Thou shalt not. Thou shalt not. You know, we're so familiar with it, we know that. But look at what Paul says here in verse 8, just by way of comparison. Romans chapter 13, verse 8. First he says, owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. And when he says, owe no man anything, he doesn't mean, he's not talking about like go get a bank loan. That's not what he means. He's not talking about go get a loan to pay off your car, you know. That's not what he means. Or a mortgage for your house. He's not saying you can't have a mortgage on your house. He's not saying you can't have a car loan. He's not saying you can't have a personal loan from the bank. That is 1,000 miles away from what he's intending here. He's not even thinking about that. What he means is, this is your obligation as a Christian to those around you. That's all he means. He says your single, where others are concerned, your single goal, your single duty, or your single obligation is to love them. That's all he's saying. when you, in your interactions with others, whether they're Christians or whether they're non-Christians or whoever they are, your single objective is to love one another. And there he says, "For he that loveth hath fulfilled the law." Now that's an interesting thought, isn't it? Now look at how he elaborates on this. Because Paul makes mention of those very negative commandments that I already referred to. Verse 9 says, "For this," now he quotes from the Ten Commandments, "thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely," what does it say? "Thou shalt." You notice it's not negative. Now it's positive. You see the difference? Not only is it a different content, but it's not phrased "thou shalt not." It says "thou shalt." Love thy neighbor as thyself. He's saying this one positive directive fulfills, you don't need all the negative ones. This one positive directive fulfills all of those. Verse 10 elaborates a little bit on it. He says, "Love worketh no ill to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law." This positive force, this positive idea of love, it says it doesn't do anything bad to your neighbor. In other words, you don't need a commandment saying "thou shalt not kill" if you have in your heart love, because love is not going to motivate you to kill anybody. In fact, just the opposite. You know what Jesus said, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life." Not only are you not going to kill somebody, you're more liable to lay down your own life. Now, when we go back to Hebrews in chapter 8, now Torrin, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 10, when he says here, I'm going to read it again, "This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord, I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts." He doesn't mean he's going to take a felt-tip pen and open your heart or your mind and write down "thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not." That's not what he means. What he means is, I am going to install a new nature, and it's a nature of love on the inside of those who are the recipients of this new covenant, this better covenant, this covenant that Jesus brought to us from God, established on greater things. I'm going to put on the inside of those in this new covenant, Christians in other words, a new nature, and it's the nature of love. And so there's no need for him to write "thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not," because in the mind and in the heart of Christians is a nature, a new nature. That's why Paul wrote to the Corinthians and he said, "If any man be in Christ, he is a new creation." Didn't he write that? He said, "Old things are passed away, behold, everything's been made new." It's a new nature on the inside of us. Here's a good illustration, though it's not very timely anymore. You know, back when we first started the church here, when we first got going, we would record everything on cassette tapes, because even back then, before we had YouTube and before we had the videos, people, you know, would move away or whatever reason, wanted to hear it again or hear the messages. And so we were recording them on cassette tapes. And the way you did it back in those days, when you had those cassette tapes, this is like, even today, this is like archaic, you know, technology. We had a duplicator, a cassette duplicator. And so you had this, the master tape was the original, you put it over here, and then you put a blank tape over here, and then you push a button, and it runs off a copy. So whatever's on the master tape puts it on the copy. That's easy to understand, isn't it? Well, I heard it explained this way. I think this is a good analysis. When you become a Christian, first time you believe in Jesus, first time you understand and place your faith in Jesus, God just runs off a copy of Jesus and installs it inside you. He just makes a copy. He just runs them off a copy. He's got a big duplicator. So Jesus is the master tape, and now you've got on the inside of you the nature of Jesus. Now, did you notice when you read the Gospels, you ever notice this? You ever look at Jesus, kind of his personality, the things he does, the way he acts? You know, he's very even-tempered. You ever notice that? He never does shoot his mouth off, and say something bad he shouldn't have said. Say, you disciples, I'm sorry about what I said yesterday. You don't find that. He treats them with courtesy and with kindness and respect, and even when he's got tough things to say, he says it in a loving way. It's because on the inside of Jesus was the nature of God, and it's a nature of love. John the Apostle says, God is love. And Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus was the love of God walking around in a human body. Now what this is saying here is, and this is what this writer to the Hebrews is trying to get across to the readers, and we're reading over their shoulders, the covenant of which we are a part is this. God says, I will write my laws in their mind and in their hearts. Meaning, in your mind and in my mind and in your heart and in my heart as Christians is the nature of God. So we don't need external commandments. We don't need to post the 10 Commandments up on the wall here and read, thou shalt not kill, for instance, because on the inside of you is a nature of love that will motivate you. It exerts pressure from the inside out. That's why he says it's superior. A nature on the inside exerting pressure is far superior to something on the outside trying to restrain. He says, I will write my laws in their mind and in their hearts. See, this doesn't mean, though, that we are always a perfect expression of it. We are not perfect in our execution, but it's always there. That's why you're always conscious if you go off the path. We all do, when I talked about Jesus, how he never said something he regretted later, we do, but we know it immediately because on the inside of us is that nature that exerts pressure. So he's just saying it's there, It's the nature of Christ. It's the nature of God on the inside of us. Then he says, I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. You know what that reminds me of? And I probably shouldn't bring this up, but I'm just going to say it. We're not going to turn and read this. In the book of Revelation, it says that, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will be their God, and they shall be his people, and he shall dwell among them. You remember what I told you that the definition of the mediator came from a Greek root word meaning among? I think that's what he's talking about. Jesus, as the mediator, he makes it possible for God to live in the midst of us. Not like in the church in the midst of us, but in the midst of us, in your midst, in you. That's what he's saying. I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. Verse 11 says, and they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for all shall know me. In other words, you don't have to go say, well, you know what, you need to go down the street and on a certain address, knock on the door, God lives there. Or you need to go to Tulsa, that's where God lives. No offense to Tulsa. We've lived in Tulsa too. We're all happy for Tulsa. A lot of churches in Tulsa, that's the joke, A lot of churches. But you don't have to go to Tulsa to find God. They shall all know me, from the least to the greatest. Do you know what? If you were a Christian and stranded on a desert island, you could be a perfect Christian on a desert island alone without even a Bible or a church or anybody else, because God is with you. He's in the midst of you. And he says they will all know me. There's nobody too small. There's nobody too insignificant. There's nobody too humble. He says, I'll make it my business that they all will know me, from the least to the greatest. And here's what verse 12 says. For, you know what the word for, it's like a conjunction joining what he just said. The previous verse 11 said, they shall all know me, from the least to the greatest. Verse 12 says, for, or you could say because I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. Now, the way I understand that, let's understand it this way. It says their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. In a formal sense, you could say that Jesus has taken away our sins at the cross, and so God's not got a record of it anymore. But then on the other hand, as I said before, we are imperfect in our execution of that nature that's on the inside. We don't walk it out perfectly. We're in the process of growth. We make mistakes. We have failings. We stray from our conscience sometimes. We stray from our path. We sometimes say or do things that we regret later. Well, that could be characterized as points or acts of unrighteousness. And here's what he says: I will be merciful to their unrighteousness. In other words, I'm patient. Just like, a good analogy is a parent. When a child is learning to walk, a parent is very patient with them. The first time a child stands up and takes a step and falls on his face, the parent doesn't blow up and say, I can't believe you did that. No child of mine would fall on his face. Well, every child falls down. Isn't that right? And even once they get going, they still have little stumbles every now and then. Isn't that true? Well, how does a parent react? Do you get upset? No. You're proud of them because look how good they are. Look how much progress they've made. I'm so proud of them. You know why? Because that child has in them the nature of that parent. Isn't that true? It is true. And that's the exact point he's making here. Now, I'd like to go back again and read these verses to you from the Message translation, because I think this really makes it plain. Torrin, if you go back to verse 7, and let's read it from the Message translation. I think this really brings the point home. I love the Message translation. By the way, the Message translation, I know this one, was made by a man named Eugene H. Peterson, a Presbyterian minister, who said that he got tired of spending all his time in the pulpit explaining what Greek words mean. So he made his own translation, which reflected the meaning in ordinary language, so that he could just, read it. So, okay, verse 7. If the first plan, the old covenant, had worked out, a second wouldn't have been needed. That makes sense. Let's go on to the next verse. But we know the first was found wanting, because God said, heads up, the days are coming when I'll set up a new covenant, a plan for dealing with Israel and with Judah. Next verse. I'll throw out the old plan I set up with their ancestors when I led them by the hand out of Egypt. They didn't keep their part of the bargain, so I looked away and let it go. Next verse. This new plan I'm making with Israel isn't going to be written on paper, isn't going to be chiseled in stone. This time I'm writing out the plan in them, carving it out, carving it on the lining of their hearts. I'll be their God, and they'll be my people. Okay? They won't go to school to learn about me or buy a book called God in 5 Easy Lessons. That's kind of funny, isn't it? They'll all get to know me firsthand. The little and the big. No, go back, I didn't finish. The little and the big, the small and the great. Okay, then we got go ahead, now you can turn. They'll get to know me by being kindly forgiven, with the slate of their sins forever wiped clean. Okay, that's a good thought. Let's go on. By coming up with a new plan, a new covenant between God and His people, God put the old plan on the shelf, and there it stays, gathering dust. Well, that makes good point, doesn't it? The new one is so far superior because it's alive. It's alive on the inside of us, exerting pressure as a new nature on the inside. And it's strong enough to handle whatever comes across our path, whatever we need. It's always there to lead us and to guide us. And that's why, by the way, that the Apostle Paul makes a great point to emphasize the fact that as Christians we are led by our conscience, by our heart. We don't need somebody else to tell us what's right and what's wrong. We know on the inside. And it always leads us in the right direction, too. That's the good thing about it. Okay, I think that's all we got today. Now, I think Ethan is here. Is that right?